honour this evening, the Right Honourable the Lord Baker of Dorking.
I think you're very wise and shrewd to invite an old political fogey like me to come and speak about Margaret Thatcher. Because quite frankly, most children today at school have no knowledge of Margaret Thatcher whatsoever. Most of you are, I can tell from your grey hairs, do have it. And I was very lucky in my political life, as was Geoffrey Archer, that we were at the high table of politics when Margaret Thatcher was around. The 1980s was the best decade in our history since the war. Yeah. And it was entirely for Margaret Thatcher. And it really was an exceptional victory, because she was a woman. The Tory party is extraordinary in its history, that it was the first party in the Western world to have a Jew as its leader and Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, the first to have a woman, Margaret Thatcher, and the first to have a nation. You wouldn't expect a Conservative party to do that. And in those days, the very fact that she came through was a tremendous triumph. The reason why she came through is that there was an enormous sense of change needed in our country. We were the weak man of Europe, and something needed to be done. And one of the things that made us the weak man in Europe was Union power. And what happened in the Labour days under Wilson is that Union leaders would be seen going into Number 10 late at night to have beer and sandwiches. And Margaret Thatcher wasn't going to have that. She was not going to divide Number 10 between the unions and herself. And what's more, she never drank beer. In fact, her drink was actually whiskey, and her husband's was pink gins, of which he was a generous partaker from time to time. And one of the things about that is you've got to realize the relationship that they had together. Often people came to me and said, how can I get at Margaret? And I said, why don't you speak to Dennis? Because he is the one who'll see her first thing in the morning and last thing at night. And I remember one night when we had a meeting at Number 10, very late at 10 or so, and Dennis had a very good evening indeed. Very, very good evening with his pink gins. And could only be heard from time to time. And she very loyally said, you know, Kenneth, he's got Qatar. And I thought it was a wonderful expression of a loving wife to a husband. But Dennis was a very important figure in her life. But when she took over, what was really quite extraordinary, that people don't realise this, what she had to do in the first 2 years made her massively unpopular. From 79 to 81, she was looked upon as a 2-year Prime Minister. And not surprisingly, inflation was 17%, rising unemployment over 15%, and nothing seemed to have been changed for the better. And that required remarkable resilience. And so in January that year, she appointed me a minister, and then things looked up. In January, the Minister of Information Technology. And I only did that because when I was not appointed in the 79, I thought it'd be Heath, I wasn't. But I then got very involved in the computing, and computing in those days was really very like AI today, because they had electric typewriters. And I was involved in a company called Logica, which those of you know about the technology is one of the leading software companies in the country. And I persuaded Margaret to visit this company, and I actually got her sitting in front of a computer. It was the only time in her life that she was ever seen sitting in front of a computer. She never did her own emails. She never read her emails. She was not in that sort of world. I only once saw Margaret on a mobile phone, and someone told her how to switch it on. She was not really engagée personally, but spiritually she was. Because I tried to persuade her that you have to embrace technology. And in the job I had, I was the Minister for the Sunrise Industries, and Tebbit was the Minister for the Sunset Industries. So you've really got to have a policy for this computing. and we had information technology here. And she said, even in 1981, when the money had also run out, she said, look, I'll give you some money to launch some new ideas in technology in the summer of 1981. And I was quite surprised. I thought I was going to have a penny to spend. And I devised various schemes. For example, we got one computer into every school in the country.
Yeah.
That sounds so minor, doesn't it? But, you know, there were no computers by offering them at half cost. And she actually launched that campaign. And then I got her to launch another campaign to give robotics to Arnold Weinstock and his great engineering country. And we gave more money to Whitehall to make them a Piper's off. The point I'm saying that, I'm not trying to boost my innate ingenious. What I'm trying to say to you is that Margaret saw something like that was necessary. She realized that the country had to move on and upward. And then her fortunes were trained dramatically, of course, by Falkland, by the invasion of Falkland. And that was very interesting. On the day that Falkland was invaded, it was invaded at breakfast time, and I'd been asked by Margaret to arrange a luncheon, number 10 that day, for the leaders of technology companies in Britain. And I'd got the 5 or 6 leading technologists in to have lunch with them. And I assumed that with an invasion, I'd be rung up and said, could you postpone it? Not at all. I was told she wants to hold this. And this was at a time when people had just invaded the island, the old Falklands, and obviously generals and admirals were talking to her, and ministers of defence to her, but she said, no, I want to speak to them. And so in the middle of this huge crisis, for a whole hour, we had a talk about telephone exchanges and computers and chips and all of that. And I was quite amazed. And little bits of paper were brought into her all during the dinner. She just looked at them. She said eventually, she said, oh, gentlemen, I'm awfully sorry, she said. I really must break this up a little bit earlier. I've got a few things to correct. And she went. It was incredible that she was so cool to bother to do that on a day that was going to change the entire history of not only of the country, but of herself. And the other thing that was also very striking about it, that when she'd become the leader of the party, there was a lot of people in the Conservative Party who were very hesitant she was a woman. The thing that really helped her enormously was not something that she did, or something that any other politician in Britain did. It was a Russian newspaper, the Pravda, who described her in 1975 as the Iron Lady. They did it. It wasn't invented over here, she didn't invent it. And thereafter, she was known as the Iron Lady. And I remember when years after we lost, I had to do a television broadcast for the BBC, and I had to interview Ted Heath. And I went down to his house in Salisbury, and there was a touching relationship between those two. And he eventually said, the worst thing that happened, she was called the Iron Lady. That was the end of it. I had no chance after that. And it was very lucky that she was so called, because she was in heart an Iron Lady, and you saw that in the way that she handled the miners' strike. She was not prepared to let the miners win. Particularly when Scargill said, it's not just money that I'm going to fight for, I want to bring the government down. And those of you who might remember it, some of you will remember how the country agonized for a whole year, and she was under constant pressure to settle. And people were always approaching me as a minister, can't you persuade her to settle? But she said, no, I want to stick it out. I really must make absolutely clear that unions are not going to run the country. And that was a major change. She did 2 really big, significant economic changes. That was to take control back from the managers and let ordinary people manage their businesses. The other one was privatization. Now actually, in the manifesto of 1979, we barely mentioned it. We were going to privatize the laboratory and possibly British Leyland. And when I'd been appointed to British Technology, she'd also appointed a person called David Young to be the advisor to Keith Joseph. Keith Joseph was the Minister for Trade and Industry. And he and I both agreed that we could do much more with BT, British Telecom. And I'd always been convinced we could sell off half of British Telecom, the telephone side. I'd written papers on all this. Anyway, we then persuaded Keith Joseph asked us to dinner. And so we went round to Keith Joseph's house in Fulham, David and I, lunch with Keith Joseph with a rather Spartan affair. He was a very important, significant figure, Secretary of Trade Ministry. And we persuaded him we should privatise British Telecom. That was when the decision was made. And I had to spend 3 years of my life privatising it. And that allowed us to privatise all the other things, gas, electricity, and water. I did water as well. And that was one of the second biggest economic change that she made. And when I went around Europe trying to show other nationalised industries in telecoms that they should be private, I was looked upon as an absolute lunatic. They've all followed her completely. And she really changed things. And the other great change she made was the sale of council houses. And that did really change Britain absolutely fundamentally. It was very interesting. I was made Education Secretary in 1986. Now, Keith Joseph presided me. To understand the Thatcher years, you have to understand there were two things that made it work. One was the intellect of Keith Joseph, and the other were the instincts of Margaret Thatcher. And to understand the instincts of Margaret Thatcher, you have to understand Grantham, the grocer's shop, and living above it. Those instincts that Margaret had right from the beginning went right through her life. And you saw little examples of it. I remember late at night at number 10, at 11:30 or 12, she'd go around turning off all the lights. That all comes from Grantham. And she had the instincts, and Keith Joseph provided the intellectual cohesion of the Thatcher years. Less government, lower taxes, building up individual enterprise. That is what we did. And in education, when she appointed me, I thought I was going to be told by Margaret, because she had been the Minister for Education in the Thatcher government. Actually, I should have said, posting all my great history, I was actually in the Ted Heath government. Do you remember Ted Heath? I was the most junior minister in Ted Heath's government. So junior, my name was usually left off the writing paper. And in that government, she was the Minister for Education. Not a particularly happy time in her life, actually, because lots of Conservative MPs turned up and said, we'd like our schools to be comprehensive, not grammar, and she signed off too many. So I never reminded her of that. But when she appointed me in education, I thought I'd be given a list of things to do, not at all. She said to me, look, there's been a teacher strike for 18 months, do what you can to resolve it with the Chancellor, and then come back in 4 weeks and tell me what you'd like to do. I was utterly amazed, because you really generally think that Thatcher tells her ministers exactly what to do. She never told me what to do in education. And I went after 4 weeks and introduced the national curriculum, giving schools control over their budgets, making the polytechnics free from local authorities, trying to restrict automatic university appointments for life, all those things that we did in our legislation we put into the Manifesto of '86. And what I like about her particularly was quite a lot of Conservatives opposed to what I was doing, but she stood by me. And what you need in politics is loyalty. And we've had an example this week where a total absence of loyalty when the immigration minister, Robert Jenrick, decided to resign. Now, in the Thatcher days, if ministers didn't quite agree with what the government was doing for one reason or another, they didn't resign. I don't think any minister resigned on grounds of opposition or principle when Margaret was Prime Minister, but some were a bit reluctant. But nonetheless, they stayed on board, because it was Lord Kilmuir, 50, 60 years ago, who said the secret weapon of the Conservative Party is loyalty. And I'm afraid when that loyalty goes, the party begins to disintegrate. And so we come towards the end of the Thatcher years, and I was her party chairman, as you said. And my job as party chairman in 1990 was to ensure that there wasn't a leadership election. There had been a leadership election in the previous year, and I was somewhat of a crank. And I wanted to try to ensure that that didn't happen again. And it was going rather well. We actually conducted a strong campaign attacking Kinnock, because I never believed that Kinnock would ever be Prime Minister of our country. And we actually began to close the gap slowly, but it was a very difficult year, because in the spring we had the poll tax riots in Trafalgar Square, but nonetheless the gap slowly closed. And then we had a party conference. I don't know if you were at it, but it was very successful, and there were great cheers of 10 more years and all the rest of it. And I thought I'd got Margaret through 1990. But unfortunately, when the cabinet was meeting just after the party conference, the one thing that Geoffrey Howe had to do was to, the trouble was she didn't handle Geoffrey very well, because when she stopped him first being Chancellor, then Foreign Secretary, and when she stopped him being Foreign Secretary, she made him Deputy Prime Minister. That's a non-job. Deputy Prime Minister is close to the grave of anyone, and she didn't treat him at all well. She took his country out evening away from him. I tried to persuade her not to do that, because poor old Geoffrey hadn't got anywhere else to live, quite frankly, in London. We had to find a general's house for him to live in for a bit, and that wasn't a good start. And quite frankly, when he was Deputy Prime Minister, he really wasn't very much involved. And there was one cabinet meeting right towards the end when Geoffrey had to report to the cabinet about the preparation of bills for the next session. That was one of his jobs. And there were several bills that weren't ready, hadn't been drafted, weren't on time. And Margaret was personally quite rude to him. And she spoke as a woman who should never speak to a man, and all the cabinet were looking at their blotters and not trying to. It was a very unfortunate experience. But 3 days later, he made the speech, which was in fact the assassination speech. And it was very difficult for Margaret to recover from that. And during that speech, I was sitting next to her. And when it finished, she turned to me and she said, "I didn't think he'd do it, but I'm afraid he did do it." And that saw the end of the Thatcher years. But nonetheless, they were dramatic and successful years. And once you look back at what's happened since then, it's been pretty miserable, quite frankly. And one of the things is that when a party turns upon itself, and when the cabinet itself decides to vote against the Prime Minister, or when members of Parliament decide to vote against their Prime Minister, and particularly if it's a woman, it's a form of matricide. You only have to have a slight knowledge of Greek plays to know what happens when matricide is committed. It's deplorable and goes on and on and on. And once a party has realised they can ditch their Prime Minister easily, it's a habit that they don't like to lose. And that is really very, very harmful to us at the moment. And we've got to realise that we've got a difficult task ahead. Just in conclusion, I would say, I've lived through 2 periods when the Conservative Party was even more unpopular than it is today. The first one was after the Suez Crisis, and I expect many of you were born after the Suez Crisis, but that was when Eden had to resign because there was an invasion of Suez by the French and the English, and America abandoned us. And I was at Oxford, and Brian Walden was the chairman. He was a very good radio interviewer, so you might just remember him. Quite the most eloquent speaker in the House of Commons, and he was then the leader of the Labour Club. And he said to me, "This is such a mess, you'll never form a government the rest of this century." This was 1956. And I took a bet with him. All I could afford was £5. Well, that kept you in Oxford for about a fortnight. But I bet £5, and of course I won, because Wilson became Prime Minister, and 2 years later he increased the Conservative majority. I also saw the complete collapse when Labour had a huge majority. In 1970, at the beginning in January, Ted Heath was 20 points ahead of Labour. 20 points ahead of Labour. He just won a great boat race somewhere, but he was 20 points ahead of Labour in January. By June polling day, Wilson was ahead in the polls, and the only paper that gave Wilson a Ted Heath victory was the Evening Standard. So all I'm saying to you, you can see amazing transformations. And I'm not trying to suggest to you that we could possibly win the next election either. I'm not suggesting that for a moment. But what Rishi Sunak has done, he's saved us from an innings defeat. There's absolutely no doubt about that. There will be a recovery in the Conservative vote. You'll get back, dear boy. So will you as well. There will be. So all I can say to you in the end, as as Conservatives, you must keep the faith. Do not get depressed and worried. Just keep the faith. Thank you.
Lord Baker has agreed to